Thank you very much. So apparently it's going to be 5 years later than we thought it was going to be. Anyway, we'll come on to that. But it is a very timely lecture. The way I was going to frame this course, welcome back to those who were watching last year. So we talked last year about what it would, why net zero in the sense of what it would take to stop global warming. But we didn't really talk about why we wanted to stop global warming at all. We sort of took that for granted. And this year's lectures are going to be about the when, which of course determines, just like the braking distance of a car, it determines how far you go, how fast you stop. And so we're going to be talking in this lecture about, and I've rather adapted this. As they say, events, my dear, events have kind of overtaken this lecture, so I've adapted it rather at the last minute to talk about the discussions that are going on at the moment. But we'll be talking about the implications of different levels of warming. And because, of course, there's a direct relationship between how fast we stop the warming and where we end up. Which means, of course, this year's lectures will be looking at the impacts of climate change. In the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we divide everything up into science, impacts, responses. And the impacts part always tends to be the most depressing. And it is important, and I really don't want this year's lectures to turn into a catalogue of doom, and it is important to remind ourselves at all times this is a problem we can solve, and it's a problem we can solve quite quickly if we wanted to. I think I reminded you in the first of last year's lectures that the amount of money made in 2022 by the global fossil fuel industry would have been enough to stop the products it sells from causing global warming. So the fact that global warming is still happening is a choice. It's because we're spending money on other things than stopping the products that cause global warming from doing so. So it's important, and particularly young people get very anxious about climate change, and it is a big and an important and anxiety-inducing issue. But it's just important to remind us it's also fixable, that's a sort of something to keep with us in the course of these lectures. But obviously I'm going to start. It's the elephant in the corner at the moment. I can't ignore the fact that we had it was a big news week last week for net zero. Our Prime Minister gave a speech, I think a few days before he intended to give it, explaining how we were going to revise our net zero strategy, and there's been a lot of judging from the sort of immediate reaction and some quick polls. It seems certainly a lot of commentators and maybe even a majority of the public think he was right to do that. And since the opposition has said very firmly they're not going to go in the direction he was setting out, it seems like it's now going to be shaping up to be an issue at next year's election. So it'll be the first time in Britain we've actually had climate as an election issue. I'm in very much two minds about this. On the one hand, I think I'll be explaining to you, and I've emphasized last year, I don't think we've had enough discussion about how we get to net zero in the political debate. I think far too many decisions have just been made by default. So in a sense, we need to welcome the fact that it's entering the political discourse. What's worrying is what we'll be arguing over. And that's what I want to be talking about a bit in this lecture. The sort of big headline, I mean, as ever with election issues or potential election issues, there's rather less in it than meets the eye. The headline which everybody took away from them about the Prime Minister's speech was putting back the commitment to phase out pure petrol and diesel cars. And this is just a graphic from the Department for Transport about new car sales in the UK. And of course, that ban only affected new car sales. And so you'll notice several really striking things about this figure. Diesel sales went off a cliff in 2016 when they discovered that they weren't quite as good for the environment as everybody thought. And they've really dropped to a pretty low level now and are still heading downwards. Remember, 2030 is probably sort of at the edge of the screen here. Petrol sales dropped a lot in sort of 2019 to 20. And they may be leveling off a bit, but the main increase, or the main trend you're seeing here, is the wholesale replacement of petrol with other fuel types, which includes both battery electric and hybrid vehicles. And so the green line won't be affected by the ban. Which, of course, means that, from the point of view of consumers, it's not very clear what the ban was going to do anyway, since it looks like if current trends had continued, we probably wouldn't have been buying very many of the pure petrol and pure diesel cars by 2030 anyway. It's also, from the point of view of the environment, it's probably not that big a deal either, and that's because that other fuel types actually contains both pure battery electric cars and plug-in hybrids. And before anybody goes and digs it up, full disclosure, I drive a plug-in hybrid. It's for the kind of life we lead, we can drive it around on the battery pretty much all the time, but only if we plug it in religiously every time we come back to the house, which is easy for us because we've got a driveway and all the rest of it. I can imagine if I was living in a house without a driveway, I think most evenings I might just not get around to plugging it in, and so I'd end up just driving it on the petrol. And I've noticed when we do a long journey, the reason we got it was because we had a kid the other end of the country at university, so we needed something which could both do the long journeys and the short journeys around town. And the consumption, to be honest, when we get onto, I won't tell you the brand for fear I'm going to get sued, but the consumption once we get onto the motorway is really no better than the old diesel we had, which of course the old diesel had other problems, I'm sure. But the point is, therefore, if it's a wholesale shift from, there's quite a lot of battery electrics going into that, other fuel types, but I think most people who wouldn't have been in a position to buy a battery electric because it didn't suit them would have been buying a plug-in hybrid. So the impact on the environment of that ban wasn't going to be that great anyway. So there we are. It's sort of probably not going to affect. And the only people, I think, and there are some people who are grumbling that it'll affect the second-hand market. But if you look at this figure, you'll realize, you'd be struggling to buy a second-hand diesel more than that's less than 15 years old by 2030 anyway. And I was sort of thinking, why would you want to buy a diesel car in 2030 that's 15 years old? And I was thinking, well, the only reason you might is if you want to stand for the council and complain that you're affected by the ULEZ. Anyway, so no doubt there will be people in that category. But okay, so I'm stressing this is, although this is what lots of people took away as a big headline from the PMC, that probably wasn't the main impact of the speech. And there was a lot in the speech that was actually really encouraging. I mean, the Prime Minister acknowledged that we're seeing, in the floods in Libya, extreme heat that we saw in Europe this summer, climate change is real and it's happening. Okay? I mean, 10 years ago, we might not have had that clear acknowledgement from all of our politicians of what's going on. He was very clear, we must reduce our emissions, and he insisted that we will still meet our international commitments and hit net zero. I'm just quoting directly from his speech here, and hit net zero by 2050. And so that's sort of encouraging. And he also insisted that we're now going to have a better, more honest debate about how we get there. And encouragingly, it was how, not how fast, or whether we're going to bother at all. And that's something that, if those of you coming to last year's lectures will be aware, something I've been calling for some time. I think we do need a conversation about how we get to net zero, because big decisions are getting made, and politicians and commentators and so on should be getting involved, because these decisions are going to affect us all. And so he introduced a specific commitment that when Parliament votes on carbon budgets in the future, it should be with the plan as well as just the budget. So rather than just saying we're going to reduce emissions by X date, we actually discuss how we're going to do it, which is probably also a good thing. So that's all positive. That's all encouraging and reassuring. There was lots of other stuff that was kind of irrelevant in the Prime Minister's speech. And one of them was he really dwelled on the fact that we've already reduced our emissions a lot. And we're down almost 50% since 1990. I mean, he could have said, actually, we're the only advanced economy that has lower emissions than it did in the 1890s, which is true. But if you remember, some of those of you who came to the final lecture last year will remember that movie I showed you of who was emitting carbon when in the past 200 years. There's a reason why we have lower emissions now than we did in the 1890s. I mean, back in the 19th century, the British economy was the most advanced in the world. We were gushing out carbon dioxide at a rate, comparable to modern standards 100 years before anybody else was. Not necessarily something to be tremendously proud of. But anyway, we are down 50% since 1990, and then he sort of disparaging comparisons with other countries that he felt hadn't done nearly as well. And again, this trope of our share of global emissions is less than 1%. Whenever somebody says that, I want to say, my taxes are a very small fraction of the take of the exchequer, so can I just not bother? It won't make any difference. See what Rishi Sunak makes of that. Anyway, how can it be right that British consumers are now being told to sacrifice even more than others? This is really disingenuous. I mean, the reason our emissions have come down are not because of sacrifices made on behalf of by the British consumer on behalf of the climate. Sacrifices were made. This is a big reason our emissions came down. We had a wholesale transition from coal to gas for reasons, sacrifices were made by miners, but I think Mrs. Thatcher's enthusiasm for switching from coal to gas would have been nonetheless had the climate issue not been there. Less well known, actually, is that a big chunk of that 50% reduction in emissions that we've achieved before 2010 or so the initial reductions that the UK managed was due to the reduction of methane emissions, mostly due to us maintaining our landfill sites better and managing our waste streams rather better than we used to. And the trigger for that, again, was nothing to do with the climate. Older members of the audience may remember this appalling incident in Derbyshire in 1986 when a bungalow, a bungalow blew up because of methane leaking out of amazingly, no one was killed. 3 people were badly injured. But this bungalow suddenly exploded because of methane leaking out of a nearby landfill site, because we'd been throwing all our rubbish, including all the food, into the same landfill. And of course, the food was decaying underground and methane was leaking up. And that was a big chunk of the UK's emissions. Once bungalows start blowing up, it didn't take much incentive for people to say, okay, we've got to fix our landfills, and we did, and we've done a much better job. It's now a bit gross to put food into the general waste. I think most people have grasped that. It's not a huge sacrifice, and we manage the waste streams so that we're not, blowing up houses in the vicinity of landfills anymore. Touch wood. So, after 2010 or so, I think you probably could make an argument that climate policy was starting to help reduce UK emissions, so we could perhaps take credit for some of that 50% reduction, but a lot of it came for free. So the sort of suggestion here that we're so much better than everybody else, we can afford to take our foot off the pedal, is really disingenuous. Where I found the Prime Minister's speech rather intriguing was when he got onto the other big headline sort of takeaway that people had when he started talking about heat pumps. He said very firmly, we'll never force anyone to rip out their existing boiler and replace it with a heat pump. Okay, a heat pump's driven by electricity, so you can run a heat pump. You can heat your home with a heat pump without, if the electricity itself is renewable, you can do so without causing any greenhouse gas emissions. And the policy was to sort of phase out heat pumps in the early 2030s. It wasn't, to be honest, the policy wasn't entirely clear before the speech, but anyway, it's clear that it's clear what he's saying now is that he's not going to require anybody to remove their existing boiler. That was never the policy in the first place, by the way, but the policy was going to be to require that if people are replacing a gas boiler, they'd have to replace it with a heat pump. But he said firmly, to help those households for whom this will be hardest, he wants to introduce an exemption so they'll never have to switch at all away from natural gas boilers in homes. But he's still 100% committed to decarbonising our homes. So if you combine those two statements, I've, of course, found this intriguing. Was the Prime Minister perhaps listening to the lecture I gave this time last year when I pointed out to you that the royalties and profits in what we pay for gas would be enough to capture every single molecule of CO2 that comes out of the boilers of our homes, recapture it from the atmosphere, and stick it back under the North Sea twice over? Gas prices have come down since then. It's now only 1.5 times over. But there's still a lot of money out there that could, if it was so deployed, actually decarbonise home heating in the UK without anybody having to take out a boiler at all. Now, hold on, before anybody sort of tweets that you found a scientist that endorses the Prime Minister's approach. He didn't actually say he was going to do this. It's important to stress that the cost of decarbonising gas in this way would be, for the nation as a whole, outrageously expensive. Although for the individual consumer, it's 4 pence per kilowatt hour on natural gas. So that's what $250 per tonne of CO2 air capture and disposal costs. If you capture CO2 out of the atmosphere and stick it back underground, that's roughly what it costs you to do that. The reason we know this number is because they're doing it in America for roughly that amount, for that level of subsidy. So it's fairly clear that it is possible. And if you think about what that would mean for a consumer, that would be £500 a year on your bill by 2050 if we decarbonised gas in this way. An increase of £25 a year for the next 20 years or so. Most people, faced with the prospect of that, would say, I'd better get a heat pump. That would be a very rational thing to do. So it would make much more sense if we were going to do this for the individual consumers to buy heat pumps instead of paying their gas supplier to get rid of their CO2. But this is the kind of open discussion I think we should be having about the climate issue, because this is a sort of big decision. Do we all go electrification, or do we require the suppliers of natural gas to decarbonise their product, that we perhaps should have been talking about as a country? At whatever point over the past few years we decided we were going to go the full electrification route. Who decided that? I mean, the Climate Change Committee thought about it and decided that was probably the best way of doing things. The civil servants in DESNZ, I'm sure, thought it through. But, and as a country, they may well be right. But it does mean it's a sort of the kind of decision that you probably should involve consumers in, because it's essentially a choice between, short-term hassle, replacing your boiler, spending a bit of money on revamping the insulation of your house and that sort of thing, but for long-term saving that most consumers would probably have a view on. And of course, there is the challenge, of course, is that if we do electrify home heating immediately, we're going to have to also put a huge amount of investment in the grid to keep pace with that new demand. And of course, there is the danger that if we don't all go to electrification, you could end up with a sort of rather ugly death spiral on the gas network, where the only people left using gas are the ones who couldn't afford a heat pump, and then they're saddled with the fixed costs of running the gas network, and you get fewer and fewer consumers, and they're generally the ones who couldn't afford to shift away, and then their bills go spiraling upwards, and I mean, this does happen. I mean, this happened with rural bus services and rural post offices and so on. You get fewer and generally well-off. The less well-off people keep using the network, and if the well-off ones all leave, then the margins, all the profitable customers head off somewhere else, and the less well-off ones get sort of saddled with the bill. So it probably does make sense. I'm not saying that the policy was wrong. It probably does make sense to encourage everybody to shift together, so you don't end up with a sort of rump consumers stuck with the old system. But I don't recall there ever being much of a public conversation about it. And we probably, we might not be in this pickle we're in now if we'd have had the conversation about it at the time and agreed, yeah, okay, this does make more sense to go the electrification route rather than decarbonising the supply. And that's, this is hopefully, this new interest from our politicians in talking about climate change and making it a political issue will mean that we'll have more of these conversations, and we'll decide collectively how we're going to get to net zero and how the burden's going to be spread between government, consumers, and crucially the industry that provides the products that cause the problem. So that's hopefully we will have more of that kind of conversation, and we'll be talking next year when we get on to how net zero, which is the topic of next year's lectures. We'll be talking about these big decisions that are being made, not just here, but of course around the world as well, and how different countries are approaching net zero, and how countries between them are dealing with how to share out the bill. What worries me is, despite the fact that the Prime Minister assured us that he was fully committed to net zero by 2050, and he was only interested in a conversation about how, if you look at the actual changes in the bill, what he was specific about were all going back, relaxing policies. The amount of warming we get, as those of you who came to last year's lectures will, I hope, remember, the amount of warming we get depends on the total amount of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere between now and the time we get to net zero. So if you delay the date at which you start reductions, you continue to drive up temperatures, and you commit to more warming in the future, because we're already at the maximum rate that we could possibly reduce emissions. So any delay adds a 5-year delay adds around 1/10 of a degree to peak warming. So by only telling us about things that we were going to put back by 5 years and not telling us what we were going to bring forward by 5 years, we were only getting what I hope is only half the story, what I fear maybe the whole story, in the government's new approach. And this is why we need politicians thinking about carbon budgets as they now do, or at least they pretend to, about national budgets. If you're going to make a spending commitment, you've got to say where it's going to come from. If you're going to say you're going to spend more on this, you've got to spend less on that. That's the kind of give and take that we should see in our discussion of carbon budgets. And this actually is, I wasn't really following politics in the 70s, but apparently in the 70s, nobody really bothered with that. You just made spending commitments and that was it. And then it was, the realization that didn't really work out meant that, politicians at least feel obliged to say where the money's going to come from when they make a commitment. And likewise, if somebody's going to say we're going to allow ourselves 5 more years before we do this, which will commit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then where's it going to come from? Or what's the alternate policy that was brought forward? One question I got asked a lot last week was, or one of the points the Prime Minister made was, well, Europe's put back the ban on petrol and diesel cars by 5 years, so we're just, falling into line with the rest of Europe, which I thought was something we didn't do these days anyway, but now we are. But of course, Europe at the same time, they brought in a commitment to introduce synthetic fuels, decarbonized fuels, where the carbon dioxide associated with that fuel had been taken care of, as part of that change. So, but I didn't hear about that from our government. So if you're going to take something away, you've got to put something else on the table. I think that's the principle we need to hold our politicians to. And that's where actually the speech got a bit worrying, and frankly a bit weird. The proposal for the government to interfere in how many passengers you can have in your car, I've scrapped it. The proposal that we should force you to have 7 different bins in your home, I've scrapped it. The proposal to make you change your diet and harm British farmers by taxing meat or to create new taxes to discourage farming again, I've scrapped those too. What's weird about this, and therefore what I found really worrying about the Prime Minister's speech, is that none of these policies exist. And, lots of people pointed this out, but I think as well as laughing slightly at the fact that, he's scrapped a whole lot of policies that don't exist, is like, what does this tell you about the Prime Minister's speechwriters, who clearly feel this is clever? Sadly, there are clearly still some, bright young things in the heart of British government who feel it's cute to equate net zero policy with number of recycling bins. And they know what they're doing, because that's in the British psyche now. If you mention net zero policy to anybody around the country, one of the, you can say don't mention an elephant, don't mention the 7 recycling bins. Oh, they've already thought about 7 recycling bins. That's in there. That's in the discourse. So it was, they know what they're doing, but why would you want to equate net zero policy with requiring people to have 7 recycling, a fictitious policy to have 7 recycling bins in their homes, if you didn't actually think climate change is a bit of a joke? If it's serious, you don't equate it with a joke. And that's what I found really worrying, is there are still clearly, and also from the reaction to the speech, there's a lot of people out there who still struggle to take climate change seriously. And, I don't want to get too serious, but it is actually a serious problem. So I do think we have to think about, why are there still people out there, probably educated in Oxford, I'm embarrassed to say, in British government, who are still unconvinced that this is actually a serious issue. And I'm sure the government would rapidly assure us, oh, no, we take it terribly seriously. Well, the proof of the pudding, if you're making it into a joke, you don't take it seriously. So, you can't have it both ways. So let's think about the reasons why people are still out there. And I think it is important for all of us to engage on this, to keep engaging on it, and keep helping everybody to understand why, we do need to take this issue seriously. And so let's go back over, this is a bit of a sort of trip down memory lane for me, back over the reasons over the past 30 years or so that people have found to say, no, climate change is a joke, it's not something we're going to worry about. Older members of the audience will remember about 14 years ago, around the time we actually published the net zero papers, there was another big development in climate science. A whole lot of emails were leaked from a server in University of East Anglia, and somewhere in many millions of lines of email, somebody found the phrase a trick to hide the decline, which was interpreted as all those climate scientists clubbing together to actually conceal the fact that global temperatures are actually going down rather than going up. It did have a big impact, not just on poor old Phil Jones, who's a personal friend of mine, and it certainly ruined his life for many years. But it probably did set discussion of climate policy back by quite a few years. By the way, the trick in question was, and it's probably long enough ago that we can kind of more safely talk about it now. It was the decline in question, and the trick to hide the decline was about the mismatch over recent decades between temperatures inferred from tree rings and temperatures observed with thermometers. So there was within climate science, there was a problem in that the tree ring record wasn't as reliable as some people would have liked to think it was. And as a non-tree ring person, myself, I remember, I didn't grumble at the time because they were getting such a hard time from everybody else that, it didn't really seem appropriate for me to pile in. But, and there's always a tendency as well for every sub-discipline of science to big up what it can do. I mean, nobody wants to say, oh yeah, this science I've been doing for the past 20 years, turns out it's a bit rubbish, it doesn't really tell you anything. I mean, it's not going to do you much good for funding if you were to do that. So individual sub-disciplines are always trying to sort of G up what their sub-discipline can offer. And there was a bit of tension between the so-called paleoclimate community, the tree rings and the ice core groups and so on, about what they could say about past temperatures versus the sort of physical modeling side of science, where we were much more focused on the recent record. And so there was sort of just enough in the story, there was just enough debate there for it to keep going for a long time. It, as I say, it did do a lot of damage. But what was, of course, what wasn't there, which of course nobody understood at the time, was any hint there was anything wrong with the actual evidence for human influence on global climate, which wasn't based on tree rings at all. It was based on the thermometer records. So the issue was with a discrepancy between a bit of information we weren't using anyway and the information we were using. So it made no difference whatsoever to our actual conclusions about human influence on global climate. In fact, I remember in the 2001 IPCC report, at the time, I was involved in the attribution chapter there, and we didn't really use tree ring data. The tree ring records were just emerging at the time, and they didn't really tell us anything we didn't know already, so it didn't seem to make any difference to our conclusions. So I remember feeling a little aggrieved at the time that they were getting so much airtime, but there we are. I'm starting to sound a bit sad now, aren't I? So let's move on to the other, the next sort of objection people make, which is that scientists can't prove human activity is actually causing the observed warming. I get this pretty regularly still to this day. I get somebody emails me saying, about once a week, somebody emails me, hello, if you're watching, and to say, can you prove it's due to human influence? You can't, so therefore, And so I will talk a bit more about that in the last 10 minutes of this lecture, because I think it is important for everybody to understand, why it is we do know that what's happening is because of human influence. The next sort of stage people might take in arguing we don't need to do anything about climate change is because the impacts won't be nearly as bad as scientists claim. We're going to be looking at that in the next 3 lectures of this series, what the implications are of different levels of warming and what the impacts are, and indeed what the impacts are of the level of warming we're already seeing, We're already at 1.25 degrees of warming, and we're starting to see plenty of impacts of that already on weather and ecosystems around the world. There's a sort of subset of this claim, which interestingly seems to be held by the same people. We're totally doomed anyway, so there's not much point in doing anything about it. Again, I think, as I stressed at the beginning, no, this is a fixable problem. If we were to reduce emissions to net zero by mid-century, we would limit future warming, all future warming, to not much more than's already happened this century. So if we did that, yes, we would still have plenty of problems, but that's not a extinction level event by any manner of means. That's a manageable ecological challenge. Finally, there's this one. Bill Gates is going to fix it all by turning down the power of the sun. The idea that some techno fix will be brought in the future to solve the whole problem. This, in many ways, I think, is the most dangerous line of all, not because it's not possible, but because of the implications of anyone deciding they're going to take charge of the world's weather for geopolitical instability. I think if we've learned nothing else in the past couple of years, it's that we're much more likely to kill ourselves directly with bombs and things than kill ourselves indirectly by changing the climate. By the time the climate changes enough to actually kill us all, we'll have already done the job for it. So I think you do therefore need to look at climate policies very much through a lens of what will this policy do to geopolitics. And that's something which I've decided to really focus on this year, is to ask, of the climate policy, and we'll be talking about this more next year, of the various approaches to climate policy, which ones are the most destabilizing and which ones are the least destabilizing? Because I do think it's really important that we look at climate policy through that lens. Because, as I say, our big problems are the Vladimir Putins of this world. But just so that you get a little bit, I am a scientist. I haven't talked any science at all in this lecture, but I've got to give you a little bit. So I just thought I'd focus in on bullet 2 here, just to remind you of what it means for the scientific community to say that we are confident that human activity is the cause of the observed warming. And because for a lot of people, I sort of was put on the spot to do this. I mean, I guess this was last really a big issue when the Trump administration came in, and there was an exchange with the then head of the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. The presenter asked them, "Do you believe it's been proven that carbon dioxide is the primary control knob for climate?" If ever there was a sort of lowball question for somebody in his position, that was it. Because even I would say, well, I'd have to be quite careful about answering that question, yes, because proven, primary control knob, there's plenty of... But no, he actually went out of his way to say, no, I would not agree. It's a primary contributor to the global warming we see. And many people respond to this, and I think this is the wrong response, by saying, well, don't be silly, 97% of scientists think it is, so shut up. That is often the response to that kind. And I think, as a scientist, I don't like that response, because science doesn't work by voting. It draws attention to the 3% instantly. So, oh, that's intriguing. What are the 3%? What do they know that the rest of the scientists don't know? In fact, I got caught out in precisely this way. When the IPCC fifth assessment report came out, I was the BBC's sort of talking head in the studio, and the presenter, who knew perfectly well what it actually meant, when the sort of light went on and I knew I was on national telly and I couldn't afford to sort of say anything too stupid, he turned and sort of twinkle in his eye, said, "So, scientists are 95% confident that most of the warming is due to human influence now. What do the other 5% of scientists think?" Okay, so, Well, it was an opportunity to explain statistical significance on national television, so I did my best. But I'm going to do my best with you now. So it's not about a vote. It's not about the fraction of scientists that think something. It's about the way we assess the evidence and reject the null hypothesis of no human influence or small human influence on global warming. And lots of science works this way, so I'm going to take you through, forgive me, a brief foray into null hypothesis testing. Please don't leave. This is really important. Okay, we start with the data, and we've got past the hide the decline argument. Everybody sees the warming. Yeah, the world is warming. The argument is about why. And everybody understands and accepts how different drivers are affecting the global energy balance. The orange line here, human activity driving temperatures up. The spikes, for example, being volcanoes temporarily driving temperatures down. These are the disturbances to the global energy budget that we went through in some detail last year about how they work and how these different factors affect the flow of energy into and out of our planet, from the sun and out back into space. And we also know the climate system conserves energy. There's nobody's arguing with that. So therefore, if we take these disturbances to the global energy budget, we can predict how we would expect the climate system to respond to them. And you'll notice that, between the perturbations to the global energy budget and the expected temperature responses, the big change is the fact that we've smoothed out the volcanoes a bit. Yeah, because if you've got a system that conserves energy, you can't instantaneously drop the temperature and raise it again. It takes a little time for the heating to have an impact. Okay, so these are sort of all things that are accepted, but what we don't know is how large the responses to these different drivers are. So when we're assessing the evidence for human influence on global climate, the first thing we do is to assume assume complete lack of knowledge. This is the way hypothesis testing works. We assume we have no idea how much these natural drivers might have actually inflated or deflated global temperatures. So between that one and that one, we sort of inflated the long-term solar variability signal here by a factor of 10. And you can see that if you do that, I'll go to a single line, so you can see, if we assume no human influence and just allow the natural drivers to fit the data as best they can, you can see that up to about 1990 or so, it's not a bad fit. In fact, if you squint a bit and you lose lose the dip, just before that dip at the beginning of the 90s, you could say that's sort of more or less capturing the overall record. And there was a paper published in 1990 by Frisch Christensen and Lassen, which hypothesized that most of the warming up until then was driven by variations in the cosmic ray flux resulting from this low-frequency variability in the sun. And it was quite impressive, the fit they got. They were lucky because, of course, if they published it even a year or two later, it probably wouldn't have looked nearly as good. And, of course, what's happened since then is the solar output has gone down, so everything's rather gone into reverse, whereas the warming temperatures have carried on up. But what we do, and also if we, that's the sort of best fit to the observed warming we can get, even with all the data to present, allowing for any amount of amplification of these natural drivers. And if we take the data we've got here, and then we just plot the residual, this is what goes on when scientists are assessing this kind of evidence, you look at the residual and you ask, does that residual look suspiciously like the thing you've left out? And it obviously does. You don't need a statistical test to tell you that what's left over there looks rather like that orange line you remember before, which was the expected response to human influence on climate. So what we do is we introduce a new unit. At the time I introduced the Pruitt, which means 1/10 of a degree of human-induced warming, CO2-induced warming, and we increase the number of Pruitts, okay, so cranking them up here, until So we've gone a little bit too far there. So you see now it's sort of going down a bit. So you can sort of adjust it around. And we find the best explanation, best in the sense of there's no leftover residual suspiciously correlated with the thing we've left out, is with about 80% of the observed warming being due to carbon dioxide emissions, and the remaining 20% overwhelmed, but due to other greenhouse gas emissions, methane and nitrous oxide. So that's the best fit we get, with about 1/8 of a degree of CO2-induced warming in 2017, and it's up to about 1 degree now. So there we are. It's up to about 0.9 degrees now, just to get that right. So the best explanation of the observed record is that carbon dioxide emissions have contributed 80% of the observed warming since 1870, and any attempt to explain what we're seeing by natural factors alone, allowing for any amount of unknown amplification mechanism for these natural drivers, leaves that residual that just looks just like the thing you've left out. And if that's what you find, then you're driven by the data, by the evidence, to conclude that what you've left out actually is playing a role in driving the warming. And this is, I just thought you might be interested to see how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change how the statements on this of confidence that we are seeing human influence on global climate has evolved over time. Back in 1995, it was the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate, nothing more. 2001, I cut my teeth on this one. This is my first involvement. Most of the observed warming over the last 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. That made page 3 of The Guardian. 2007, most of the observed is very likely. So they increased the confidence level, and they got the Nobel Prize. I'm only a little bit bitter. And 2013, to be fair, I was involved in 2007 as well. And it's extremely likely, this is all sort of tightening up the confidence with which we can be sure that what we're seeing is, and also introducing a new element in 2013 is to point out how the size of the observed warming, the fact that our best estimate of the human-induced warming was the same as the total warming we were observing. Finally, in 2018, in the special report on 1.5 degrees, we actually started using some numbers, which I think we probably perhaps should have done many years earlier, because you've got the really interesting piece of information for people is how much of the warming, what's the number, how much of the warming is due to human influence, what's the range of uncertainty on that? And there we are in the latest. It's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. That's in the latest IPCC report in 2021. And to bring this all bang up to date, a paper published by Piers Forster and many co-authors, including myself, earlier this year to bring all these indicators up to date. And if you want to find out where we're at, there's a nice website, climatechangetracker.org, which will tell you that when we get to 2022, we've already passed 1.25 degrees of warming, and warming at almost 1/4 degree per decade. So you don't need to be you don't really need to be a climate scientist to realize we haven't got long to turn things around if we actually want to limit warming to anywhere close to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think the impacts of climate change that we're seeing around the world already is plenty of motivation enough, even if the Paris Agreement itself wasn't enough to justify doing that. So, when net zero? Every 5 years delay adds another 1/10 of a degree, more than 1/10 of a degree, to peak warming, because we're already at the point where we won't be able to reduce emissions. By delaying now, we're not going to be able to reduce emissions faster in the future. Every 5 years delay is just pushing up the warming we're committed to. We still have to work at explaining that the evidence that climate change is a serious problem. Apparently so, because I'm afraid there are people, maybe not our Prime Minister, but certainly his speechwriters, who still think it's worth a bit of a joke about recycling bins. So I hope you can take that with you and go convince these people that this is something worth getting our minds around and worth taking seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Myles. I'm sure you can predict that many of the questions are intensely political, so I'm just going to separate some of those out and ask you some more factual ones, if I can do it first of all. Is it correct that we don't include shipping, aviation, or imported products into our carbon budget? And so, in which case, have we really reduced our emissions by 50%?
When you include shipping, aviation, the 50% claim does include, I hope I get that right, but apologies if I don't, I believe the 50% claim does include sort of 50% of the shipping and aviation emissions associated with travel to and from the UK. But it's true that, as of the past few years, the UK, I believe, is following Europe in including international aviation emissions in our commitments. So our net zero 2050 commitment, for example, does include shipping and aviation, which is important because obviously shipping and aviation is a big deal. But it's also, they're two sectors where we probably have the least idea how we're going to get rid of those emissions. So it's important that they are included. So the answer, short answer, yes, they are included, but your question is quite right. They're not included very consistently, and across the world, there's still plenty of scope for wriggling around when it comes to shipping and aviation.
And do all countries, or is there significant variation in which the way these things are measured from countries and the way in which, therefore, pressure is put on politicians?
Yes. Emphatically so. And although shipping and aviation is probably the least of our problems, well, it's one of our problems, but the really big problem in that how different countries quantify their emissions is the one which I hope some of you remember from the carbon cycle lecture from last year, which is how a country counts its trees growing faster through no action of its own. I heard today, there's increasing excitement about this sort of trees growing faster approach, and news this week, a Dubai-based company has just bought 10% of Liberia for the carbon-absorbing capacity of its forest. And if that doesn't worry you, it should, because this is the kind of transaction that only makes sense because there's an enormous scope for muddle in that part of our carbon account.
Which leads on to another semi-political question, which goes back to Rishi Sunak's speech. He said, we're only a little country, what we do doesn't matter. So
I don't pay I'm not a very wealthy man, so whether I pay taxes doesn't matter.
So the question is, why chuck money at our little country? Why don't we really put more money into other countries where the problem is greater?
If the money we're spending was assuredly getting the world on a path to net zero, then I think there's actually a strong case for both. But I don't think you can do it as an either or, because you can't have every country saying, oh, well, we'll pay somebody else to reduce their emissions. After a while, we're going to run out of people to chase. I think the other argument, of course, for us moving early, there's a very strong argument. We led the world into this. We ought to be leading the world out. And the obvious commercial benefits to actually getting ahead on the transition. I thought it was one of the most interesting things about the Prime Minister's speech was just how cross the Society for Motor Manufacturers was. So there's clear, paying other countries to transition and then deciding to be last ourselves. It seemed to be it might be good environmental policy, but it seems quite stupid economic policy.
Before I open it to the floor, there was anybody at Ian Mudway's lecture the other night where he was talking about basically the accumulation of waste. So he pointed out that we now have exceeded the biomass of the world on accumulated man-made products. And the companies are not being taxed on the production of the waste products. It overlaps with your argument about taxing the producer, if you like, causing the producer to pay the bills. Would you like to expand on that and see if there's any overlap between them?
I always like to expand on the principle of producer responsibility, as people will recall from last year. If you're introducing a product into the world economy that has an irrevocable impact, I think we should have a principle that you have to fix that impact or not introduce the product. And this could be applied to plastic. It could be applied to carbon. And I think this is something we should be talking about. It would make undestroyable. What's the word? It would make products that don't non-degradable products substantially more expensive if the people selling them had an obligation to get rid of the material that they're made of. But eventually, I think that's the only way we're going to control our waste streams. Because those companies have the agency to do it, the people who buy their products generally don't.
Hello, Patrick Newman here. What do we mean by we've reduced our emissions? I mean, we're adding to the emissions, total emissions in the atmosphere every year, and we seem to have forgotten what the historical cumulative emissions are.
No, that's a very good point. Sorry.
No, that was basically the point I'm trying to make.
No, it's a very good point. The UK started emitting 100 years before anybody else did, so our cumulative emissions in 1990 were enormous. We've reduced the rate at which we emit, and that's what politicians love to talk about. But yes, all of that period we've been adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, continuing to drive up global temperatures. Which is why, as we'll be emphasizing in the lectures next year, we need to be getting ready to take carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere in the second half of this century, because of all the countries in the world, we've probably got one of the greatest responsibilities for doing that. A very good point.
I wanted to ask you about Bhutan. Is it making a positive contribution to CO2 emissions and global warming?
Bhutan.
Yes.
Bhutan is one of the countries of the world which has declared that it's already at net zero, they actually have a relatively small fossil fuel economy and a large forestry sector, it's perfectly plausible that they are, on the way we do our accounting, effectively net zero already. I'm not too fussed about Bhutan making that claim, but using the same accounting system, Canada could also make the same claim, and that would matter. So we don't have time to wander off on the problems with greenhouse gas accounting systems at the moment. As you know, that's a point which exercises me. But the point is, if you're still burning fossil fuels and you're not sticking CO2 back underground, then you're contributing to the problem. And Bhutan is in that category, I'm afraid. Very small. They're not the one I would want to pick on. But it's just, we need to establish the principle that if you're taking it out, you've got to put it back. Whatever's happening to your forests at the time.
Thank you. You mentioned fake offsets, such as existing forests. Are we any closer to proper understanding and recognition of the real of true offsets, i.e. geological net zero and putting it back in the ground?
In many ways, true. It's a much simpler problem. We know what it takes to get rid of CO2 permanently. You've got to re-inject it under the North Sea and compress it and so on. And that's we know we can do that. We know the industry can do that. It's just a whole lot more expensive than planting trees. And we haven't done it at the kind of scale we're going to need to do it. So I don't think it's true that we've really got our minds around what it's going to take. There's lots of hand-waving about the vast potential about the North Sea as a CO2 repository, but until it starts happening, I don't think we haven't discovered how hard it's going to be. Maybe it'll turn out to be quite easy. Who knows? Let's hope so.
Is it even understood that it's needed?
It is understood that it's needed in the sense that we will generate more fossil origin CO2 than we can afford to dump in the atmosphere. That's an absolute certainty. And therefore, we're going to have to get rid of it permanently. And right now, the only at scale method of getting rid of CO2 permanently is sticking it back underground. There are some other ideas out there. You can turn CO2 back into rock, or you can effectively inject it into the Earth's oceans by making the oceans more alkaline. Again, these are sort of large-scale, modifications of our. That's a sort of large-scale modification of our planetary system. Generally speaking, just sticking it back underground where it came from looks like the safest option to me.
Hello, just you've not given very many figures tonight. I understand you're trying to avoid that. But when I was a student, I do remember being told that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 200 parts per million. What is it at the moment? Because I was told that above 400 per million was reaching a critical point.
It's about 420 at the moment, and I don't think it was when was it 200 parts per million? It was 350 in 1980 or so, or 1990 or so. So it's been going, so extrapolate backwards. So that's the speed with which it's going up. The impacts are driven by the temperature, the warming. So that's why I've been focusing on the fact that we've got to a certain, because most impacts of climate change scale with the global temperature increase, not with the level of CO2. And that is at 1.25 degrees attributable to human influence up from the 19th century. And it's going up at 1/4 degree per decade. Yes, I haven't showered you with figures, but those two should be enough.
And one last question.
Hi. When it comes to net zero, do you think the problem of climate tipping points are discussed enough? Because if you're adding 0.1 degrees and you get to a tipping point, it's not something really people are talking about on a political scale?
So scientists certainly worry about it a lot. I mean, lots of us do little else than worry about non-linearities in the system's response. In political discourse, what worries me about the discussion of tipping points is we've already reached the tipping point, which I hear quite often, which I'm sure sends the message to people, well, in that case, what's the point? And so I think that's quite dangerous, or we're certain to cross the tipping point, or we will cross the tipping point if we cross 1.5 degrees. Again, there's no evidence for that. The more, I don't want to send the message, therefore it doesn't matter. Every 1/10 of a degree does matter, it makes the impacts worse, but there's no evidence that something extraordinary and global happens when you go from 1.5 to 1.55. So, and those kind of messages can be really harmful because we will reach 1.5 degrees. I mean, the rate we're going in the not too distant future. And the last thing we want is for everybody to think, oh, well, we got to 1.5 degrees, so that's that. There's nothing we can do about it. So this is a stoppable problem. But of course, the further we get away from pre-industrial, the more we've destabilized the natural carbon cycle, the natural systems of our planet, the harder it is to stop. And yes, of course, you can get into a situation where global warming would simply continue without any further emissions. And that is a pretty frightening prospect. We're, at the moment, as far as we can tell, quite far away from that. Not far away, but if we manage to limit warming to well below 2 degrees or around 2 degrees, we're unlikely to get into that regime. But it is a disconcerting prospect, because of course, that doesn't necessarily mean, again, even then, it wouldn't mean it's too late, the planet's going to turn into Venus, there's nothing we can do. It would just mean we'd have to spend even more money dragging CO2 out of the atmosphere to pull temperatures down again. So the tipping point, it's actually more about just how expensive is it going to be to fix the problem, not is it utterly unfixable.
I'm going to leave you with a question to answer next time, which is has there been a measurable impact of the war in Ukraine on CO2 production?
Gosh.
You don't have to answer that.
Okay, it's certainly been a measurable impact on climate policy. And so, and certainly, and level of interest in climate policy and so on. It was depressing how, in Glasgow, at COP26, we had all these decisions that we were going to abandon. One of the key commitments in Glasgow was we were going to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. As soon as gas prices went through the roof, our own government discovered that actually a bit of fossil fuel subsidy was quite a good idea. As I say, the best policies don't last first encounter with reality, unfortunately, which is why we have to keep thinking about it.
Well, you've clearly got us thinking, everybody online thinking, big problems. Myles Allen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.